Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the VAK Indian History Podcast. I'm Utkarsh.
Namaskar, Sumedha, welcome back.
And we will continue our journey into blending the present and the past. And this is a topic that I'm quite interested in. In fact, I requested for it. Let me explain where I am coming from, and then, of course, we will see where that takes us. So, what's the theme of 2025, 2021, actually 2022, the theme of the last 3, 4 years? It's been all about the global world order changing, great power rivalries, moving from a unipolar to multipolar world, so on and so forth. And it strikes me that all of this commentary, all of this conversation is on a fundamental assumption. Assumption is it's very Eurocentric, America centric. It used to be the American century. Before that, it was the European century. Now it's becoming something else. So it's always from a certain vantage point. It's like the map of the world that we see that we assume this way is up and this way is sideways. So the map could be in any direction, but we always take that. So similarly, we always look at it from this great power, which is US, Europe part. And we think of it from those terms, and hence everything seems rather disjoint right now because the relationship between the US and Europe and the rest of the world is changing. I was thinking that if I had a magnifying glass and we zoom out a little bit, if I zoom out really looking at history and scale and knowing what we know from some of the conversations we've had on this podcast, the last 250 years is an anomaly, historically speaking, because for thousands of years before that, as far as we know, the majority of global output was not from Europe and America. It was from basically this part of the world, uh, India, China, Asia, basically. And now, one of the themes of this century is that it looks like these parts of the world, India and China particularly, are rising again to the global mean, to the average that they used to be. So, for me, as I look at it as a graph, I see it was straight line all the way, dipped during the European and American century. Now it's rising up again. So, isn't that a better way or another way of looking at it? That the norm was basically Asia having a certain size, being a great power. It was taken away for a short while, and now it's returning to the norm. No one's talking about it in that way. So I thought, why don't we talk about it in that way? And that's where I hand it to you.
So, Utkarsh, there's so much in this little speech of yours, so much to unpack. The first thing that you said was look at the map and we think of ourselves as north or south. Look at the map and look at the Mercator projection. The Mercator
Mm,
projection gives Europe an outsized uh,
mm,
presence in this map, which it doesn't have. It's actually just a tiny little tail end of the
mm.
Asian continent. Not even a continent in itself. It's just made itself one, made it up.
Yep.
But then we accept it. And you are very right when you say that for the past 250 years, definitely, and maybe even a little before that, we've started thinking of everything in very Eurocentric terms. The balance of power, the balance of GDP, economic as well as political as well as military power, was such as if it was only this little obscure corner of Asia which existed and nothing else did. You talked about a graph of presumably, I think you meant either economic production, GDP, or did you mean military power? What did you mean?
I just meant output GDP.
Yeah.
GDP.
So if you meant that, then the best place to go to is a source which even the most skeptical will accept. That is the OECD World Data Series. So there is a very famous economist called Angus Madison who has now passed away. He spent a lot of time making a world GDP chronological graph map. So those are books upon books and 1,000 pages. But Wikimedia Commons has kind of distilled it down into a very easily understandable graph. So the what you were talking about, the ups and downs, let us look at it in terms of hard numbers. So I hope you don't mind if I share my screen again and we look at a few actual numbers. Oh, this is for a little later. Right now, I want something else. This one. So, can you see a very, very clear kind of graph, Utkarsh? Utkarsh, you're on mute.
I'm going to say I've seen this graph, but I feel it's very distorted because it compresses 1,000 years into a tiny space, and then
Yeah, it's
it's
very
the time is not,
distorted.
yeah.
Yeah, but there's a reason for it because information from the past is not easy to get, as we know to our cost, being part
But you
of
should
this
still
Indian history
extrapolate it
podcast.
to be equivalent, and
Well,
then you will basically see,
okay. So,
yeah,
accepting those shortcomings, it is
hmm,
still a snapshot of the way
correct,
things
correct.
moved. So, let's just go to say 1700s. Look at the graph of Western Europe and look at the way it started going up. Does it remind you of something that happened during the 1700s? Something very big which helped these people to exploit a lot of others and gain a lot of economic strength? So,
India.
shall we? India, colonization, the shifting of resources and the shifting of money power, economics, everything
Hmm,
away from Asia and Africa and to Western Europe. Remember, viewers, we've spoken about $45 trillion being moved from India to Great Britain. You can see that kind of result, and the figures would be similar, or maybe not that big, because India was the prize, the jewel on the crown, so to speak. But there would be comparable numbers. So you see, and then look at India. Can you see where it has started falling down 1700? So
hmm.
this chart shows you a very clear picture of how and when all resources started shifting to the Western world. And then, the US was a little late to the party, slightly late, but okay, it arrived there and did its own thing. And just look at India and China and look at where they were in the 1970s. China has pulled itself up. It has really pulled itself up. And it's already the second largest GDP in the world. India is still, kind of just about starting to do so. Let's see what happens in the next 10, 15, 20 years. So this gives you a perspective into why we have all been so Eurocentric. Because power lay, I'm going to stop sharing this right now, but I will come back to this because it's a very important way in which to just visualize the relative power of different continents. So if we think of the rise of the West. So, what do the people themselves, what kind of explanations do they have for it? Very, very laudatory ones, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the rule of law, the rules based order, the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was, maybe we should do a program on it once compared with different things that have been said by Kautilya. It was a very moth-eaten document, but it has been raised into being the harbinger of the free world. So I was listening to Farid Zakaria, a good theorist, a good propagandist of the Western nations. Of course, a very nice little brown sahib from India. So he said, I'm now quoting him. So the defining characteristics of the rise of the West, it was not religious in character. It was because of the Magna Carta. There were constraints on the ruler. There were rights for citizens, independent courts, a sovereign church, sanctity of private property, and this is why the West rose. From the global South, again, which is a very loaded term, but I'm using it anyway, from the global South, from Asia, we have a very different view of it. All this looks like a lot of hypocrisy to us. It was the way in which the wholesale loot of Asia was justified to themselves and indeed to Asians, many of whom have actually, taken this in completely and believe in it. If you listen to talk shows or read magazines today about the changes in the world order, there are a lot of people who will be scaring you with this world is sliding into anarchy. What kind of anarchy? The anarchy of great power rivalry. When was this great power rivalry? So let's say 18th century to the 20th century. The 20th century, it reached its absolute climax. So these were the years in which the West did its best to absolutely wipe out the rest. I think I'm going to patent this. But the let me give you some numbers about the kind of wars that happened in the 18th century. in this little corner of Asia, which is called Europe. In this little corner of Asia, there was the War of Spanish Succession. Then, because France was kind of winning it, nobody wanted the French to control the Spanish, so there was a lot of fighting, and then some kind of balance of power was achieved. Sweden fought with Russia, and by the way, it was only in the 18th century that Russia emerged as a great European power. Only in the 18th century, not before that. The Habsburg Empire was collapsing, Prussia was rising, the decline of the Ottoman Empire was happening. And the Ottoman Empire is, I think, one of the biggest evidences against this idea of Europe. Because the Ottoman Empire is very much in Asia and it very much controlled parts of Europe. So this kind of division just doesn't work. But I live in Europe, and if I mention this to any Europeans, they totally lose it. The idea of Europe not being a continent on its own, they totally lose it.
Hmm.
So anyway, in the 18th century, these were the wars. And I've tried to find out how many people died. So this is obviously a kind of rough measure, but about 4 to 7 million deaths in this
Hmm.
century, right? Then we come to the 19th century when this was the apogee of the colonial wars, the Napoleonic Wars, imperial wars of UK, France, Portugal, Netherlands. All of them were fighting in different parts of Africa and Asia. And there was this whole colonial rivalry going on. This is what great power rivalry means. And what did it mean in terms of deaths? So there were 30 to 60 million deaths in this period. And most of those, the British killed 15 to 25 million people. Most of those deaths came from India. But then Europeans have also, remember, wiped out the North American continent of all its tribal population. And it was not through great wars and fighting as they would have you believe, but most of it was
Disease.
smallpox. Yeah, most of it was
Hmm.
smallpox. And they used to give smallpox laden blankets, clothes, etc. to the tribal so that, and they had absolutely no defense against this smallpox, which
Hmm.
was imported from outside the continent. So they were wiped out like, flies. So that is how
Hmm.
many, that is 30 to 60 million deaths in the 19th century, Utkarsh. But we've not reached the climax yet. In the 20th century, the First World War and the Second World War, which was actually European powers jockeying for
Isn't the
greater
First
strength.
World War basically a family feud between the
Yes.
descendants of Queen Victoria in a way?
Yes. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
In a way, from the
Yeah.
Tsar of Russia to
And
fight.
they did not even learn anything from the First World War, Utkarsh. They fought,
Hmm.
and a lot of people died. So in the First World War, 12 to 18 million Europeans died. And the number of non-Europeans was comparatively less. It was 2 to 4 million. So, bringing in a lot of other people in their fights, they killed 2 to 4 million people. But not satisfied with that, they went in again for another war. And at that time, 40 to 50 million Europeans and about 25 to 35 million non-Europeans died. So, not only were they killing themselves, they were killing others in their own disputes. You and I are very familiar with the First and the Second World War and the different theaters of war and who was fighting whom. And in any case, well, this is not VAK Indian history, but for people who want to do it, they can just look up the First and Second World Wars and see all the different theaters in which it was fought and the number of non-Europeans who fought in it. The number of Indians who lost their lives in the Second World War was huge. So I'm giving you
Hmm.
an aggregated figure, 25 to 35 non-European. So how many is that? That's 100 million. So in the 20th century, 100 million people lost their lives due to this kind of great power rivalry. Therefore, if Western commentators are afraid of a phase of great power rivalry, I do not blame them. Great power rivalry was a terrible, terrible thing. They not only killed these many people, they devastated large parts of the world, killing off indigenous civilizations, degrading them to poverty, degrading them to what we've seen in that chart over there. So this is why they are afraid of great power rivalry. And this is where what you said in the beginning comes in. Is there some way of looking at the world which does not go back, hark back to the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries and start thinking in those terms that, oh my God, if now the US and Russia start fighting, or China and the US start fighting, what's going to happen? Which is what so many of these doomsday scenarios are talking about. What if China and the US have a fight? What if Russia and the US have a fight? So, is there some other way of thinking of it? I think that question is a great one, and I will answer it in a bit after I get your feedback on what you think of this stage setting.
Yeah. So I think two or three thoughts emerge from that. The first one is there is no doubt that the so-called European great power rivalry of the last 300 years has, maybe it's due to technology, maybe it's probably due to technology, has had much more of a global theater. That is my assumption. Then great power rivalries in the past. So this is not just an observation, but it's a question to you. Is that true? My suspicion is it is, but you might say that even previous great power rivalries had such a broad global
Utkarsh,
theater.
could you elucidate a little bit? You think that is because of technology that the theaters of war have been spread across the world? Why technology? It's because of colonization.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a valid
Yeah,
point.
yeah.
It's a valid discussion. Yeah.
It's because so many of them went and said this
Hmm.
territory is Dutch and that is Portuguese and that is French. And if the French
Hmm.
and the Portuguese are fighting in Europe, then they must fight in India.
Hmm.
What about look at the huge effects of the Anglo-Dutch wars in India? So
Hmm.
England and the Dutch, the English and the Dutch were fighting, and it was happening in India. So that
The
I
question,
would say
yeah.
is because of colonization.
So the question then comes from me is, do we have a precedence for such a big theater of war prior to this, whatever the root cause might be? That's the first thing that strikes me. The second thing that strikes me is that is there a
Utkarsh,
fundamental
I just want
Hmm,
to interrupt you a bit. When you
hmm,
ask about the dispersed theater of war, are
hmm.
you asking this question as an example of the power of Western countries or the devastation wrought by them? What is your angle? What is your
No,
what's
I'm not
the
trying
thinking
to
behind it
pass a value judgment. I'm just trying to get
to
uh
understand?
relatively just trying to understand whether the theater of question number one is the theater of war of this European great power rivalry indeed larger than any theater of war prior to it?
That
That's
it
question
is.
number one.
That it is.
Yeah. And secondly, what's the root cause? Because you could argue there are two differences of root cause, which also gets into a deeper discussion, which is we say it's colonization. So why was there comparable colonization in the past that we don't think about because it's further away from us? Or there was no comparable colonization in the past? I think that's kind of the question. So, for example, when you had the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire, did you have anything that we would recognize as modern day colonization, but obviously in a very different time period versus today, right? And what was the great power rivalry during such periods? So that's the one thing interesting for me. The second one is there seems to be, as we've talked about in many different episodes, kind of a difference in underlying philosophy between, say,
Yes.
the way people of, say, the European part of Asia look at the world and ways, say, the people of this part of Asia look at the world. Right? We talked about man versus nature, part of nature, nature being the bounty. Does that have an impact in terms of how great power rivalries happen now versus when they happened when Asia was more dominant? Those are my two questions
Yes.
slash observation.
Yes. So this is here where our expertise, I hope we are developing some, in terms of understanding and setting out history comes in. Because what we'll now try to do is some kind of comparative analysis with certain caveats, many caveats, in fact. There is, of course, the recency effect and the evidence effect that we know more of the last 250, 400 years than we know of 2000 years ago or 2500 years ago. And also, you mentioned technology. Technology did not have a role in expanding the theater of war, but definitely in the number of people who died. Because the technology of killing people has just gone from, well, worse to worse to worse. or better to better, I don't know what to call it. You can kill more people in, I guess, 30 seconds today than you could 2000 years ago. You would have to, do something very physical to a person to kill them 2000 years ago. And here is just whatever AK-47, or I am probably very dated, whatever the latest weapon is. And you can kill so many people in one. So technology plays a role over there. Therefore, we have to adjust for that kind of killing technology. We also have to adjust for means of transport. So we have to think of it in perspective. Today, it is, or even in the 18th century, with steam ships, it was much easier to, or much quicker, easier as well as quicker to cover long distances. So, as there is a book which I'm going to quote later. His name is Bruce Rich. Now, Bruce Rich has written an interesting book on Kautilya and what it says for the world. But I'm going to quote something else. First, maybe I should tell you who Bruce Rich is. Well, he's a attorney and director of the international program at the Environmental Defense Fund. So as you will see, his angle is also a little bit of save the environment and sustainability, etc. But what he says in this book, which he has written, The Message of Kautilya in the 21st Century, is that if you allow for the speed of the means of communication, the Indian subcontinent at the time was so big that it was kind of like managing a global empire today. The amount of time it would take to reach from one end of the empire to the other or to send messages, etc. I mean, obviously, now today we don't take any time at all. So you'll have to take into account all the differences in technology, transport, etc., as well as the fact that for all the years which have passed by, our evidence is not as clear as the numbers, for example, that I told you. A simple search will give you so many documents which will tell you how many people died in the Second World War because it's all documented. So having said all this, your questions were, of course, was there some kind of great power rivalry set up in some earlier days? I think the number of powers in Europe, which was, well, at least half a dozen, if not more, who were all extremely powerful because all of them were not contained in their little tiny geographical areas in Europe, but they controlled a lot of resources because of their colonies. So they all had a good deal of power and they could fight with each other. What I want to set up as a comparison is, say, take the 6th century before the Common Era. Now, there is a very famous academic called Karl Jaspers who calls this period as the axial age between the 2nd and the 8th century, focused on the 6th century before the Common Era. It was during this time that there were two big empires in this world. One was the Seleucid Empire of Asia, the other was the Mauryan Empire of India. China was not yet in the picture because, it was still in the warring states period till about the 3rd century. In the 4th century, when the Seleucid Empire and the Mauryan Empire were at their apogee, China was still in the warring states period with a number of clans, South, Qin, etc., fighting with each other. So it was not really in the picture. And Greece was absolutely fragmented because post Alexander, it had been totally fragmented. Macedon had become a very small place. Egypt was a small player. I'll show you a map a little later. Or maybe should I show it to you? I'm going to set up this period as the comparison for today. So perhaps I should show you the map.
Yeah, sure.
It's very difficult to catch the, yeah, I think, yes. So can you see this? You can see that big blue thing called the Seleucid Empire.
Yep, yep.
You can see the Mauryan Empire. You
Hmm.
can see Ptolemy. And if you train your eyes a little bit more to the northwest of the map, you can see Macedon. You can see
Hmm.
Thrace, Macedon, etc.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And there were a lot of other smaller empires in Asia. And like I said, I'm not taking China into account because it had really not come into its own in terms of military power. So
Mm-hmm.
let's look at this. So how was the balance maintained in this kind of situation? The great powers here are two really big powers and certain smaller powers here and there in Africa, in Europe, etc. So, did these two try to fight with each other and just divide up the world between them? Remember, I am drawing a parallel between 18th to 20th century European great powers, and these are 6th century Asian and uh, African and European great powers. So, how did these empires deal with the world? And before you say that there was, there will be a lot of people who will say, what nonsense is this? There was no, there was no global world at this time. Everyone, they were all silos. There was absolutely no global world. Now, for that, we have again discussed it a number of times. And I just want to show you another map. I don't have it on my laptop, but I have another book and I'm going to show you this map and just ask you if you can see the world.
Well, you'll only be able to see it if you unshare your screen because your picture is
Okay,
very small right now.
okay.
So you can unshare your screen and show it if you like. Yeah, now it's better. Yep.
So let me see. I want you to see the little arrows which are marking the trade routes.
That is quite a optimistic ask, even for me.
Okay. So then I'll just tell you. So I'll just tell you instead of this map is from a certain book on history by Upinder Singh. So anyone who wants to see this book, see this book, they can. Okay. This is a history of ancient
Hmm,
and early medieval India,
hmm,
right?
hmm,
She is talking about the 5th century BCE. And with India as the center, there were trade routes which led to Southeast Asia, which led to Japan and to China on the eastern side. On the western side, there were trade routes which led to the Gulf and from there to Europe. There were also overland routes from Asia to Europe. Utkarsh, you'll remember that in earlier episodes, we have already looked at these kind of trade routes. And
hmm,
why am I repeating it? Because I want to tell you that there was this whole
hmm,
globalization. It was not as quick. And probably you could not circumnavigate the world so quickly. But trade from one end of the world to the other end of the world happened via sea, inland
hmm,
trade, inland river routes, inland, overland routes, everything. And these trade routes have been very well documented. So there
hmm,
was a global world. That is my point. Now, if
hmm,
there was a global world and if there were these great powers, then what were they doing in terms of their interrelationships? Were they, like in the 20th century, killing 100 million people? What were they doing? So, for this, it's very instructive. Again, I'll just open that map again. So, it's very instructive to think about what was happening. I told you that this was the axial age. Why was it called the axial age? Because let me tell you, of the number of most, the intellectual flowering of the human mind, which came into being around this time from across the world. In India, of course, the Ved and Upanishads are older, but they were also sharpened. Vedant came into being. Vedant is one of the very important philosophies. We've discussed Vedanta, Utkarsh, in
yeah.
our consciousness episode. So that came into being. In China, you had Confucius. In India, you had Gautam Buddha. Then you had Lao Tzu, you had Mahavir, you had Zoroaster, you had Socrates. So the ideas of universal ethics, the ideas of how human beings should interact with their environment, all of them came up during this period in this kind of political background. So they were busy not in fighting with people, not in killing millions of people, but in thinking about the place of the human being in this entire scheme of things, whether it be Socrates,
Can I
whether
ask
it
a
be,
separate question?
yeah,
General understanding is that 20th century post World War II
hmm.
has been the least violent period in human history measured as violent deaths as a percentage of population. Is this period comparable? My suspicion is it would be higher, right?
I really could not answer, Utkarsh, because such evidence does not exist. Because
True,
this
true.
question, it's difficult to answer. I don't know how one could actually find out. Although I would say that since there was a general peace, big peace established between these two big empires, and Seleucus had the other people from Egypt, from Macedon, etc., and from Thrace. All of them basically he had them under his control. They were his allies. So I would be not very surprised if ever we found evidence that it was as peaceful as so-called 20th century
Do you want to
post-World
know
War
what your
II.
friend Google says?
What does it say? Yeah, tell us,
Most
tell us.
peaceful
You
period in
share your
human
screen.
history.
Share your screen.
How
Let
do
me
I
see
share my
what my
screen?
friend Google says.
1 second. I'm showing how well I am, how good I am at sharing screen. Okay. Google, 1 second. Okay, I'm not able to share my screen. 1 second, sorry. It's hanging. Give me 1 sec. Okay, let me try one more time. Okay.
Otherwise, just give us the highlights if it doesn't share.
I have to give Zoom privacy, allowing me to do something. Okay, I have to enter my Apple password. This is not the plan for the Zoom may not be able to. Okay, I need to reopen Zoom, so we can't do that. Let me give you the highlights.
Yeah, give me
I
the
need to
highlights.
reinstall Zoom. Key historical peaceful period, the 21st century. Overall, percent people dying from war is at a historic low. I don't think this is very controversial because population is so large. But you will love the next two: Pax Romana and Pax Britannica.
Wow. Wow.
Pax Romana, 27 BC to 180 CE, 200 period of relative stability in the Roman Empire, featuring expanded trade and infrastructure, though border conflicts persisted, so they admit that. Pax, or is it Pax? I don't know, my pronunciation may not be perfect. Britannica, 1815 to 1914, a century of relative peace in Europe and the Americas. I think, weren't there wars in the 19th century?
I just listed out all those wars. I just told you the number
Yeah.
of people who died.
Oh, sorry, don't trust Google at
Please
all.
don't trust Google. And so I have now Googled something which I asked them how many people
Yeah,
died post World
yeah.
War II, 20th century. So
Hmm.
it was marked by significant mortality caused by the after effects of war, communist regimes, regional conflicts. 60 to 80 million died during whatever World War II.
Hmm. Hmm.
86 million people were killed from 45 to 2000. 86 million
Oh, wow.
because of post-war famine, displacement, communist regimes, Cold War conflicts. See, there was the Korean War, there was the Vietnam War, there was the Chinese Civil War, there was the partition of India, Arab-Israeli wars, Cambodian genocide, Rwandan genocide. So, Utkarsh, I think your question is kind of answered.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I would perhaps say that
But you don't know
would
these
not be.
details about that period in history, so you can't say there was
Yes.
nothing then.
No, we can't say anything much, but
Hmm.
we can
Hmm.
definitely say that post World War II, 20th century was not this rubbish Pax Americana, Pax whatever, Ana, I don't care. And, all the people who died in Vietnam, I'm going to tell them, no, no, it doesn't matter that you're dead. If you lived in the most peaceful period of human history. This is absolute rubbish, Utkarsh. Forget about what
Okay.
happened during Seleucid Mauryan times, but definitely post 1945 to 2000. If 86 million people died, cannot call it the most peaceful period of human history. How can you? It's a lot of
Because the
people.
population is 7 billion. That's why, as a percentage.
No,
Depends on how you measure it.
so what was it in the 20th century? In
I don't know
1945?
that.
So
I'm
let's
sure it
see.
was higher.
It was not 7 trillion. So population in 20th century. So between, I think, from 2 to 6 billion. So as a percentage of that, this 86 million is not nothing. And I also have another view, Utkarsh, even if it is, say, just 2% or
Hmm.
whatever it is, can you really think of deaths in terms of percentages?
No, you have to
I
see the
don't.
absolute size. That's
No,
one way of looking at it.
and also, for the countries which were devastated and the people who were absolutely wiped out in, say, in the Rwandan genocide, how can
Hmm.
you justify it saying, no, 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 overall it's okay, you're just in a small percentage? So that is a
Yeah.
ridiculous way of looking at things.
Hmm. Hmm, hmm.
And in any case, this whole theory of most peaceful period does not really stand. And as I said, I
Hmm.
cannot tell you about the actual number of
Hmm.
mortalities because there is just no figure of that. But I'll try and see. Maybe there are some Roman accounts or some Greek accounts. Let's see. It's an interesting
Hmm.
thing for me to follow up.
Hmm.
The
Hmm.
point I was making was how did these two great powers, what did they do? So one thing that I told you is that there was this intellectual flowering.
Hmm.
And what
Hmm.
was the other thing? That Seleucus and Chandragupta entered into a friendship treaty, the very famous
Okay.
friendship treaty mentioned by the Greeks and the Romans, and we have a lot of information on that. He ceded
Hmm.
territory. He gave Afghanistan, parts of Afghanistan, and the Makran coast and all. He gave it to Chandragupta, and he got 500 battle elephants in return for that.
Okay.
He used them in the Battle of Ipsus to defeat his rivals. And it was probably
Okay.
the descendants of these elephants used by Hannibal
Oh,
in that
okay.
very
Hmm.
famous
Yeah.
battle. So the relations between great powers can be
Hmm. Hmm.
non-hostile.
Hmm.
They can be cooperative. They can be constructive. So this was Chandragupta and Seleucus. What happened when Chandragupta's son Bindusar became the king? There's very little about Bindusar in our
Hmm. Hmm.
historical accounts, but what little there is points to continuing friendship between the Romans, the Greeks, the Seleucids, and the Morgans.
Hmm. Then what happened after that?
After what?
After Bindusar. We know what
After
happened, but
Bind,
you can illustrate.
yes, after Bindusar, the greatest, the best, the one most wonderful, Ashok, who most Westerners have not been able to get over, but that's a different
Hmm.
story. So, in that
Hmm.
case, of course, people will agree. So, can you see the difference between these two?
Hmm.
Another thing that Western historians, like my best friend Niall Ferguson, is very fond of quoting is
Oh,
the
is he? Oh, you really? Oh, is he your best friend? Okay.
in the sense
Oh,
that
that kind of friend. That kind of friend.
yes,
Okay.
yes,
Okay.
that kind of friend.
Hmm.
Scare quotes. So he is very fond of quoting Thucydides, who wrote about the Peloponnesian War and the fight
Hmm.
between Athens and Sparta. And there was a
Hmm.
very famous quote, also used by Mark Carney in his speech a couple of weeks ago at Davos,
Hmm.
that the strong do what they must and the weak suffer. That's what's
Hmm.
happening. That's what great powers do. That's what had happened in that period. And then between Athens and Sparta, there was a war, and then all of these city states had fallen into a terrible bout of
Yeah.
war with each other,
Yeah.
and the weak ones
Yeah.
had suffered. So they want to go back to that and say, see, that was a time when the strong were powerful and the weak had to suffer, and let us not do the same thing again.
Hmm.
They don't have this other model. Which is the other model? The other model is the one I keep talking about, the Kautilyan model, the model of dharma. In this
Hmm.
Kautilyan model, why do nation states exist? It is simply so that the strong cannot overpower the weak. I've mentioned Matsya Nyaya before in this podcast. So the whole
mm,
idea is that Matsya Nyaya, where big fish eat the small fish, should not exist. That is the driving force behind civilization, behind creating of nations, etc.
mm,
So can you see the contrast? And if Niall Ferguson had ever taken the trouble to read Kautilya, he would not have needed to talk about Thucydides. Mark Carney would not have needed to talk about Thucydides. He would have had much better models in front of him. But of course,
mm,
the way in which this whole huge swath of humanity and this whole huge swath of intellectual ferment and intellectual excellence is ignored
mm,
is something that we keep talking about in our
mm,
podcast all the time.
mm, mm,
So, which brings me to the new model, the different model that we can look at if we want to reject the great power model. So, my whole thesis, if I can put it in very short here, has been that Western historians cannot get out of the trap of talking about great power rivalry, talking about the use of brute strength to overpower weak people, because that's what they have done through their history. They have used military and brute power and some kind of a lot of cunning uh, tricks to overpower indigenous and native populations. So they are not able to understand any other model of operation. During the Cold War, they thought it was this balance of power business. Then it became the unilateral power of the US. Then what came into being? Rules based order. A myth, if there ever was one. We discussed it in the Trump episode. So they just don't have any different way of thinking. Therefore, they are very afraid of what the 21st century is going to bring to them. But what I
mm,
say in answer to your question is that there is a way of looking at great power relations, not in terms of strong overpowering the weak, fighting, killing, exporting disease, etc., but in terms of cooperation, exchange of intellectual ideas, expansion of trade, and thinking of the world as a whole. In fact, Indian foreign policy has now started with this Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, that the world is nothing but one family. So that's another way of looking at it. So this is what my thesis is. So any feedback or questions?
Isn't
Because
that
after
is
that,
that is that thesis to idealistic versus human nature versus the way of
in a
nature?
sense, it is. In a sense, it is. But then, thankfully, you don't have to depend on my idealism, but on Kautilya's realism. So the whole
Mm,
idea that the world can be brought into this kind of balance has been explained and in a very intricate and micro kind of way by Kautilya's theory of international relations, the ones we already talked about. Remember, Mitra, we talked about Mitra. We talked about
yep,
different
yep.
ways in which to deal with other countries. Either you do it via treaties or you do it via hostility and war, and how to maintain some kind of balance. Anybody who has not heard our episode, please go back to the Trump analyzed in Cottillion terms episode and listen to that. So yes, it is, but it's not unworkable, Utkarsh, because it's not just, you see, it's not just Kautilya who has this idea of cooperation, but couched on a base of realism. Because you look at somebody who is very much lionized as a realist political thinker, Hans Morgenthau. He says kind of the same thing. Then you look at somebody who was lionized in earlier days, Machiavelli. Machiavelli is actually, it's a his frame is very small and very limited, but he is also a realist. So there are enough realist ways in which to actually, what can I say, use this idealist framework. So put idealism and realism together.
Mm. Okay, that makes sense. Interesting. Yeah, that's kind of the key takeaway from this, right? That violent overpowering of any rival is not the only way to look at great power
Yes,
rivalry. And we have an example of it from history. That's essentially the summary
yes,
of what we are saying in this episode.
yes. And you see, there was a time, a good 1,500 years, maybe 2,500 years, where India was the most advanced and powerful nation in the world. But did it go around colonizing people? It did not, because it is not in the DNA of Bharat to colonize. What is in the DNA of Bharat is dharma, dharmic way of looking at things. So, colonization is a very, very, Christian concept. God, gold, and glory. So therefore, we will subjugate all these people. If they are not Christian, then they are barely human. So we'll subjugate all of them. Utkarsh, you had asked me another question, which I have just remembered. So, is there any parallel to this 18th to 20th century
Mm,
colonization in past
mm,
history? Yes, of course,
yes.
there is a very big one. The wave of Islamization of the entire world. That was
Mm,
colonization at its worst, because it was also wholesale and brutal killing at a level not seen before. In India, we know the stories of Taimur Lung, the number of people he killed in Delhi in a single day. And the number of, today there are studies being done of the number of missing Indians because they were killed in the Islamic invasion. And that runs into millions. And
mm,
you think of where the Islamic juggernaut started and see where it ended. They basically overpowered quite a bit of the world. So that is one other model which started from the 7th century. That model of colonization is also there. Therefore, when you say Asia, Utkarsh, we have to be very careful. The Asian viewpoint is not a monolith. So I've been talking about the Indian one. There is this Islamic one, which is also Asian. Then you have the Chinese model and the Japanese model. So, the Japanese model in the Second World War was not something that we would like to go back to.
mm. Okay,
And
yeah,
the
that makes sense.
Chinese today are doing their colonization with Chinese characteristics, just like capitalism with Chinese characteristics. Look, look
Yeah.
at the Belt and Road Initiative.
But isn't, okay, let's ask this. Maybe this could be a parallel discussion. I think we need to do an India China episode. Isn't China, in a way, also based on the Dharmic civilization to begin with? There's so much influence. So why is it looking at it differently versus India?
So, Utkarsh, it is now in the grip of Western ideology, communism. It
Hmm.
has forgotten its
So,
moorings
okay, so
completely.
Mao's cultural revolution worked.
Yes. And there's nothing dharmic, nothing Indic, very little Asian about China. Some of the cultural characteristics of its population, maybe it has not been able to really get over, but its driving force has now become a Western ideology of
Hmm.
communism
Hmm.
with Chinese
Hmm.
characteristics, as they're so fond of saying, everything with Chinese characteristics. But look at
Hmm.
their way of tying people up by giving them handsome loans at a very exorbitant rates of interest. And then after that, basically, you are a kind of indentured labor of China. So they have their own methods of doing things. So if we want to
Hmm.
look at it from the Asian point of view, we could, do different episodes on Japanese,
Hmm.
Chinese. The
Hmm.
Japanese are maybe not so pertinent today, but the Chinese way of colonizing the world, in which they think they are the middle kingdom and the rest are just somewhere below them and above them is heaven, that's not very reassuring. That's not reassuring at all. But I want to bring in a few other people to support the hypothesis that I was giving you. The hypothesis that there is a dharmic way of looking at the world and great powers need not always fight. So, as far as Kautilya goes, he has, of course, talked about war, extensively about war. Under what circumstances should you fight? How should you fight? And what should you do after you win or lose? After you lose, he basically says, keep quiet and, bide your time, fight again till you win. That's his thing if you lose. If you win, what do? You are not supposed to, go for depredations to the people that you have won over. First, there should be zero civilian casualties in any war. No one else should die of famine, disease, etc. Nothing. Then There should be no interference with local culture. The king, after he goes over there, should try to become as much part of the local culture as he can. The populace should start loving the king. Can you see how different this is from the colonization
Mm-hmm.
trope? Very, very different. And India, in fact, has never believed in military colonization. India has always operated on soft power. So everything that we talk about, the dissemination of ideas, of games, of knowledge, of math, of calculus through the trade routes, that's soft power. And look at Southeast Asia. It was made in the mirror image of India till the 7th century when the Islamic
Mm-hmm.
juggernaut came and basically replaced
Mm-hmm.
Indian soft power with Islamic hard power.
Mm-hmm.
So that is the other way of looking at it. Now, it is in this book by Bruce Rich, that he says the same thing that I am telling you about the dharmic method. But you know, these Western intellectuals, they can never say that anything Hindu is good, they have to make it Buddhist. So he has made it Buddhist and he insists that it is Dhamma. But I know that what he is talking about is basically the Indic concept of Dharma. And there are people like Amartya Sen and people like Martha Nussbaum who actually are toxic people. But even these toxic people who have a very kind of deep, deep hatred for everything that is Indian, even they have to admit that
Mm-hmm.
there is something needed in international life and globalization, which is beyond thinking of the of the market as God. So, what does Bruce Rich say? He says that three things which should be there. You should think about transcendence, not just what is happening today. You should not just think in anthropocentric ways, but you should respect all of the environment, which is a very Hindu way of thinking. Sustainability as opposed to the Christian idea of conquering. And you have to realize this ethic of universality and sustainability through personal reflection, which amounts to a kind of existential transformation of the current Western way of thinking. So this is what Bruce Rich says. And, Martha Nussbaum also says that Dharma is great. And then after that, she gives her own tenets, 10 tenets of Dharma, which is a lot of nonsense. I'm not going to repeat it here. But dharma is very, very clearly defined in the Indic context. So it's not very difficult to have a dharmic great power relation format. And that already exists in the Cotelian format. Another thing he has said is that what happened in the past is not the past, and you can't say that was the past and this is the present. What happened in the past and what happened today are, in a way, coterminous if you think of them ideologically. So if you think of the fight between the strong and the weak and the
Mm-hmm.
way to actually deal with it, then it doesn't matter whether it is the Peloponnesian Wars or whether it is Magad and Vaishali or whether it is today's Russia and Ukraine. The principles remain the same. So I would therefore posit to the answer to your question of looking at it through an Asian view. I would say yes, there is definitely an Asian view, not only a political and geopolitical, geostrategic Asian view, but also a ethical, dharmic values based Asian view, or maybe more Indian view.
Yeah, so that basically sets a framework of it's a little bit different from how Mark Carney looks at it,
Yes.
which is to say that okay, this is like what's the name of that book? Aldous Huxley, Brave
The
New World
Brave New World. Oh, I thought you were going to say Animal Farm.
or Animal Farm, but it's a little bit different from that, and it's more what Hakuna Matata, Lion King.
Hakuna Matata is no, that's too idealistic.
That's
But
too
yes,
idealistic. That's went one
of the
step too
two,
far.
yeah. That's a step too far. Kautilya would never believe in Hakuna Matata. But I feel from your reaction that you are a skeptic as far as this view of great power relations goes. Now that is fair enough, Utkarsh.
See, I
For
have
me
worked in
also,
many large human organizations, and I know how humans operate. So that
yeah,
makes me a skeptic. Let alone this
yeah,
is in a it is in not even a political setting. right? This is just in terms of how to sell things to people. So hence my skepticism.
No, I perfectly accept your skepticism, and I am only positing this framework as a way of sparking thought. I am not saying that this framework will be able to work and this is what we should make it work no matter what. It doesn't happen that way. There are too many real factors which are there to look at. My point, however, is that the way things are being analyzed today is very, very, you know, one sided and very, very particularly in the context of Western history. So, being the VAK Indian History podcast, I think the idea was to analyze it in terms of Indian historical precedent and not just European and Greek historical precedent. That was the idea,
And I
and
think
not
we
Hakuna Matata.
and I think you succeeded. I think it's a different way of looking at it, which I think majority of us assume that great power conflict, just fighting with each other is the default. And what you've shown
Yes,
is that that's not necessarily the default. There are other alternatives.
yes.
Yep.
Or
Okay,
at
very
least,
good.
Utkarsh, get out of Europe and open your eyes, look around at the world, look around through time, and see what happened at different parts of the world. It's always possible to draw some inspiration from somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, I get really tired of these very limited Eurocentric kind of analysis that whether it is John Mearsheimer or Mark Carney or Niall Ferguson or Farid Zakaria, all of them limited, self serving, hypocritical, and afraid of the future.
Yeah.
So, this is just presenting an alternative historical analysis. That's the purpose of this podcast. Sometimes we give you the facts, and sometimes we analyze those facts so as to give you a new perspective.
Yep. Good. That was very interesting, actually.
Yes, and I hope that we get questions from people. If you think
Yeah.
that, well, I am just going full Hakuna Matata, tell me so. If you feel that there is something that can be said for a ethics-based international
Hmm.
relations
Hmm.
framework, something that can be, above and beyond just this winner takes all and divide up the spoils, that kind of thing,
Hmm.
then,
Hmm.
well, get back to us. Tell us what you think. And we are now, as you can see, back in the saddle and, well, hopefully galloping towards at least 50,000 subscribers. We are at around 45, I think. So the new
Hmm.
5,000, please come quickly.
Yeah.
The
Come
current
faster than the
45,000.
spread of the ancient empires. Come faster than that.
Yes. The current 45,000, please share, subscribe, or ask other people to subscribe. And please give us some feedback. We love feedback. It helps us a lot, encourages us a lot. Please comment, give us feedback, engage with us. Tell us whether you would like a live session. I think we can do a live session, live Q&A, Utkarsh.
Hmm. Yeah, we could probably schedule that sometime.
Yeah, yeah. So this was wonderful talking about history, my favorite occupation.
Great. And we'll be back soon with something hopefully equally interesting. We have some things planned.
Yeah, more of STEM perhaps. I
Yeah.
hope you all enjoyed the surgery in ancient India, and we'll have more of STEM. Thank you. Namaskar.